Welcome back to our deep dive into the brutal wars that history often overlooks. In Part 1, we explored conflicts like the Congo Wars, the Taiping Rebellion, and the Korean War. Now, we'll continue by examining more brutal yet underreported wars, shining a light on the human cost and the devastating consequences of these conflicts. Let's continue with the Iran-Iraq War. The Iran-Iraq War 1980-1988 was one of the longest and most destructive conflicts of the 20th century, yet it rarely receives the attention it deserves. The war resulted in the deaths of an estimated 1 million people and left both countries economically devastated. The conflict began when Iraq, led by Saddam Hussein, invaded Iran, hoping to take advantage of the chaos following the Iranian Revolution. What followed was a brutal war of attrition, with both sides resorting to chemical weapons, human wave attacks, and missile strikes on civilian populations. The war's brutality is hard to overstate. The use of chemical weapons by Iraq against Iranian troops and Kurdish civilians is one of the darkest chapters of the conflict. Thousands of people were killed by mustard gas and other chemical agents, leaving survivors with lifelong health complications. Iran, in turn, sent tens of thousands of teenagers to the front lines in human wave attacks, many of whom never returned. The war also saw widespread destruction of infrastructure, with entire towns and villages reduced to rubble. Despite the war ending in a stalemate, with neither side achieving their objectives, the scars of the conflict continue to shape the politics of the Middle East to this day. Next, we turn to Southeast Asia, where the Indonesian War of Independence 1945-1949 was a brutal conflict that followed the end of World War II. After centuries of Dutch colonial rule, Indonesia declared independence in 1945, but the Netherlands sought to reassert control over its former colony. The war that followed was marked by guerrilla warfare, atrocities against civilians, and widespread destruction. An estimated 200,000 Indonesians were killed during the conflict, along with thousands of Dutch soldiers and civilians. The brutality of the war was compounded by the fact that it took place in the aftermath of World War II, with much of the population already weakened by years of Japanese occupation. The Dutch forces, seeking to suppress the independence movement, resorted to harsh tactics, including mass executions, bombings, and the destruction of villages. In turn, Indonesian forces engaged in guerrilla warfare, targeting Dutch soldiers and collaborators with hit-and-run tactics. The war ended with Indonesia's independence in 1949, but the conflict left deep scars on both sides, particularly in terms of the brutal methods employed to maintain colonial control. In Africa, the Algerian War of Independence 1954-1962 is another conflict that is often overlooked, despite its brutality. The war was fought between France and Algerian nationalists seeking independence, and it resulted in the deaths of an estimated 500,000 to 1.5 million people. The conflict was marked by guerrilla warfare, terrorist attacks, and brutal counterinsurgency tactics by the French military. Civilians were caught in the crossfire, with entire villages being wiped out and hundreds of thousands of people displaced from their homes. One of the most notorious aspects of the Algerian War was the widespread use of torture by French forces against suspected Algerian insurgents. Reports of abuse, including waterboarding, beatings, and electric shocks, became a major issue both within France and internationally. The conflict also saw the rise of the National Liberation Front FLN, which used bombings and assassinations to target French soldiers and civilians. The war finally ended in 1962, when Algeria gained independence, but the brutal nature of the conflict left deep divisions in French society and had a lasting impact on France's relationship with its former colony. Another brutal yet often forgotten war is the Sri Lankan Civil War 1983-2009, which resulted in the deaths of an estimated 80,000 to 100,000 people. The war was fought between the Sri Lankan government and the Liberation Tigers of Tamil Eelam, a separatist group seeking an independent state for the Tamil minority in northern and eastern Sri Lanka. The conflict was marked by brutal fighting, with both sides committing atrocities against civilians. The Leti, known for its use of suicide bombers and child soldiers, waged a guerrilla war against the Sri Lankan government forces for over 2 decades. One of the most brutal aspects of the war was the use of suicide bombers, including the infamous assassination of former Indian Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi in 1991. The Sri Lankan government, in turn, carried out heavy military offensives, often targeting civilian areas in an effort to crush the rebellion. The final stages of the war, in 2009, were particularly bloody, with an estimated 40,000 civilians killed during the government's offensive to defeat the Leti. The Sri Lankan Civil War left deep scars on the country, with tens of thousands of people displaced and countless families torn apart by violence. The war ended in 2009 when the Sri Lankan military finally defeated the Leti, but the legacy of the conflict continues to shape Sri Lankan politics and society to this day. Despite the war's brutality, it remains relatively underreported in global discussions of civil conflicts. Another conflict that deserves more attention is the Biafran War 1967-1970, also known as the Nigerian Civil War. This war resulted in the deaths of an estimated 1 to 3 million people, most of whom were civilians who died from famine and disease. The war began when the southeastern region of Nigeria, dominated by the Igbo ethnic group, declared independence as the Republic of Biafra. The Nigerian government, determined to maintain national unity, launched a brutal military campaign to suppress the secession. The Biafran War is infamous for the humanitarian disaster it created. The Nigerian government implemented a blockade that led to widespread famine in Biafra, resulting in the deaths of countless children from starvation. Images of starving Biafran children shocked the world and brought attention to the concept of humanitarian intervention, but international efforts to stop the war were limited. The Nigerian military's tactics, which included bombing civilian targets, were ruthless, and the war's aftermath left deep ethnic and political divisions in Nigeria. Despite the immense human suffering caused by the conflict, the Biafran War remains largely forgotten outside of Nigeria. Another lesser-known but incredibly brutal war is the Second Sudanese Civil War 1983-2005, which resulted in the deaths of an estimated 2 million people, with millions more displaced. The war was fought between the northern Sudanese government, which was dominated by Arab Muslims, and the southern rebels, who were predominantly Christian and animist. The conflict was driven by ethnic, religious, and economic tensions, particularly over control of the country's oil resources. The Second Sudanese Civil War was characterized by extreme violence, including mass killings, systematic rape, and the widespread use of child soldiers. The government of Sudan employed militias, such as the Janjaweed, to carry out atrocities against southern civilians. Entire villages were destroyed, and the war created one of the largest refugee crises in modern history, with millions of people displaced from their homes. The war finally ended with the signing of the Comprehensive Peace Agreement in 2005, which eventually led to the independence of South Sudan in 2011. However, the conflict left a legacy of instability and violence, and South Sudan has since faced its own civil war. Finally, the Guatemalan Civil War 1960-1996 is another brutal conflict that is often overlooked, despite its immense human cost. The war resulted in the deaths of around 200,000 people, with the majority of the victims being indigenous Maya civilians. The conflict was fought between the Guatemalan government, supported by the United States, and leftist guerrilla groups. It was driven by deep social and economic inequalities, with the indigenous population being marginalized and oppressed by the ruling elite. The Guatemalan Civil War is notorious for the widespread atrocities committed by the government's military forces and death squads. The government carried out a campaign of genocide against the Maya people, with entire villages being massacred, women and children being raped and killed, and survivors displaced from their ancestral lands. The US-backed military also used brutal counterinsurgency tactics, including torture, extrajudicial killings, and forced disappearances. Despite the signing of peace accords in 1996, the legacy of the Civil War continues to haunt Guatemala, with many survivors still seeking justice for the crimes committed during the conflict. From the Iran-Iraq War to the Biafran War, these lesser-known conflicts have had devastating effects on entire nations, yet they often remain in the shadows of more widely discussed wars. By shedding light on these brutal and complex conflicts, we honor the countless lives lost and deepen our understanding of global history. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell for more deep dives into history's most impactful yet forgotten events. Thanks for watching, and let us know in the comments which conflict surprised you the most. We'll see you in the next video.